Hello, Skullbrains. Welcome back to Skullbrain TV. Is Richard's journey about to come to the end at the hands of an evil genie? Let's find out in the next episode of The Ancestral Trail.
When he, who is the chosen one, shall tread upon the ancient path and battle there to overcome
the forces of the dark.
The Ancestral Trail, an epic story of myths, magic, and monsters. Book 25, Fenrar, the Desert Stalker, Danger and Deceit at Dead River Sands.
Yes, in the last episode, our three heroes were captured by Cyrus, a malevolent genie. Shrunken to a minuscule size, they were trapped in a bubble with other prisoners of the evil enchanter. After deciphering the prophecy passage, the three managed to escape along with some landsman warriors of Melik's kind. The group regained their size with one of Cyrus's potions and retrieved the weapons of the landsman. Richard is given a suit of armor from one of the landsman's fallen brethren, and upon their escape, Richard is cornered by Cyrus and awaits his doom. So, how is Richard going to escape? Before we find out, let's go over the ancestral challenges for this issue. Look out again for Shumi and Shubi. Also, keep an eye out for the Hidden Life Force pod in one of the illustrations. As for Morbane's Monsters and Magic challenge, you'll find a link in the description to this issue's Monsters and Magic cards. Read up on werewolves and witches, and see if you can guess who Fenrar is based on. Fenrar, witches or werewolves? In the last episode, did you guess who Cyrus was based on? If you guessed the Genie of the Lamp, yes, you were right. And did you notice who voiced Ronek, one of the trio's newfound companions? It was an actor by the name of John Redding, who you should all recognize as the voice talent behind the series' opening credits and the reader of the Book of Prophecies passages. Okay, are you ready? Let's do this.
On the 25th day, walking underneath the sun, do not fear the vision double. Do not waver, do not run. Falsehood now is not a trouble, shifting shapes amid the sand. Travail the three by deserts well, a toothy welcome is at hand. To chink ajar the gates of hell.
Even as Cyrus lifted his finger to deliver the death spell, Richard sensed Golan's voice going through his mind.
The words that free will also kill.
Richard concentrated hard. Their names spoken backwards 3 times had freed them from the bubbles. Perhaps the same spell would work against Cyrus. "Cyrus, Cyrus, Cyrus!" Richard yelled. Cyrus looked at Richard with a face as black as thunder. His finger quivered with the power of suppressed magic. Richard sighed inwardly. He had gambled and lost. Then he noticed that something odd was happening to the genie. Cyrus's limbs and features were shrinking inwards, as if someone had pulled a plug in the middle of his body. He shrank smaller and smaller, his frame imploding towards a glowing red disc that had appeared in the middle of his torso. The genie dwindled further and further until he disappeared entirely. Then, the red disc began to shrink until it was little more than a pin-sized ember. For an instant, it hung in mid-air, then vanished, leaving only a wisp of orange smoke that drifted away across the room. Richard, Orkin, and Melik dashed through the door in pursuit of the landsman, who had been waiting a short way down the tunnel. When they heard what had happened to Cyrus, there was a loud cheer. Then, with Richard and Ronek leading the way, the group moved on. At the end of the tunnel, they burst out into fresh air on top of the mountain. Before them, in a wide natural bowl, lay the lake that fed Sorcerer's Falls. "There's one more pod at Wizard's Well," Richard told Ronek. Do you know anything about the place?
Only that it's in the desert and guarded by a host of different beasts.
Ronek replied.
We'll come with you.
No, Richard said without hesitation. You head back to the Ancestral City and join Golan. Reluctantly, Ronek and his landsmen bade the trio farewell. What does the Book of Prophecies say, Melik? Richard asked as he watched the landsman disappear in the distance. Melik flattened the tome and read the prophecy aloud. Well, Richard pondered, apart from a toothy welcome, it doesn't throw any light on the beast that Ronek mentioned. It seems more concerned with deception, falsehood, and shifting shapes. Well, it could be the desert itself, Orkin suggested. The dunes move every year, creating new landmarks and covering the old. In the desert, you can rely only on yourself. Nothing else is certain. Maybe you're right, Richard said somberly. The three made their way down to the bottom of the mountain, where Richard took out the Pathfinder. They followed its golden arrow through the last canyons of Yellowstone peaks until they arrived at the desert. The desert stretched far into the horizon, a rolling carpet of sand that broiled beneath the blazing sun. Every dune looked alike, as did the valleys that separated them. All that moved was the constant upward shimmer of hot air. All that could be heard was the sound of the companion's own breathing. Gripping the Pathfinder, Richard stepped into the gritty landscape. Once in the desert, the trio's progress slowed to a snail's pace. The dunes were treacherous, their hard, sun-baked surfaces hiding slippery depths of sand. More than once, they climbed a slope only to have the ground give way beneath them, sending them slithering back the way they came. As they struggled, the sun blazed down on their shoulders and backs. Richard could feel the leather straps of his new armor biting into his flesh, yet he found it surprisingly light to wear, and it did not seem to trap the heat at all. He was glad to have it. Danger could be lurking behind any dune. Richard's fears were confirmed when the rolling sandhill suddenly ended, revealing a parched expanse of flat ground. In the middle distance, he could make out three figures moving towards them. They looked exhausted, but had, nevertheless, an erect, purposeful air. Look, Richard grabbed Orkin by the arm. Who do you think they are? I don't know, the warrior scowled. It's hard to tell in this heat. The haze tends to distort everything. Best take no chances. We'll walk in single file. That way we show a smaller image and just might go unnoticed. They bunched up in a line. Richard was dismayed to see their enemies do the same. He stared angrily at the indistinct blob that shimmered across the sands. Get down, he hissed to Orkin and Melik. They did so, and immediately their foe did likewise. Richard turned on one side to draw his dagger and saw a mirror movement come from across the plain. A thought suddenly struck him. He raised an arm, so did one of the newcomers. He thrust his dagger in the air. His opponent did the same. Then Richard stood up. Over the sands, an indistinct figure rose to its feet. Richard sighed and sheathed his weapon, as did the man opposite. It's okay, he told the others. It's a mirage. As they scrambled to their feet, he explained further. There are millions of specks of sand floating in the air. When the sun hits them at a certain angle, they become a natural mirror. We've been scared of our own reflections. Look, Richard danced a jig. Orkin and Melik watched, amazed as their supposed enemy mimicked Richard's every movement. Come on, Richard said. Let's go to Wizard's Well. The companions trudged on, and as they advanced, the figures disappeared. A few moments later, another set of shapes loomed before them. Another mirage, Orkin exclaimed. They're real trees, Richard shouted excitedly as they got closer to the shapes. It must be Wizard's Well. The trio rushed forward. Sure enough, the trees were real, waving palms that stood around a crystal blue lake. The oasis shone like a jewel of fertility against its backdrop of barren desert. They headed for the water, but were confronted by a huge lizard that scuttled from behind a clump of rocks. Richard felt sure it was one of those they had freed from Dragora's lair.
Welcome to Wizard's Well,
The lizard said.
I'm Fenrar.
The reptile's greeting was friendly, its expression open. Any lingering doubts Richard might have had were dispelled. We're looking for the life force pod, Richard said. Do you know where it's hidden?
Pod? No, but I'll help you look for it. Why don't you have a refreshing swim before we start? You look as if you've had a long, dusty journey.
The trio needed no encouragement. They hurried to the water's edge and unbuckled their weapons. Richard eased himself out of his armor and piled it under a tree. Melik placed the Book of Prophecies alongside. The three removed the rest of their clothes and rushed into the sparkling waters. While the trio splashed about, Fenrar watched them through slitted eyes. When they were fully occupied, he slunk forward and removed their belongings, one by one, hiding them behind a dune. Then he crept back to his place, under the trees. Richard was only witness to what happened next. Some sixth sense made him glance back at the trees, and what he saw rooted him to the spot. Fenrar was changing shape. His legs were getting longer, his tail shrinking, ears prickled on his head, and his jawline sharpened into a canine muzzle. Dark, wiry hair sprouted all over his body. The transformation was complete within seconds. In place of the lizard, there was now a wolf. Fenrar raised his head and gave a ferocious howl. Richard understood everything in a flash. The shifting shapes in the prophecy now made sense, as did Ronek's stories of the Oasis being guarded by many different beasts. The three were in the clutches of a monster that could change its appearance at will. "Let's get our weapons," Richard shouted. Fenrar laughed as the three floundered out of the water and stumbled across the sand to the spot where they had left their equipment. "He's taken everything," Orkin said in frustration. With a wolfish grin, the beast loped lightly towards the trio. His eyes were gleaming red slits, and long loops of saliva drooled down from his open jaws. He surveyed the three sodden figures with relish.
I'll take you first,
he said, pouncing at Melik. The wolf moved fast. Orkin and Richard had no chance to stop him. One moment, the scribe was standing beside them. The next, he was gripped in Fenrar's jaws. The wolf backed off, all the while keeping his eyes fixed on Richard and Orkin, in case they tried to flee. "Run! Save yourselves!" Melik shouted, squirming between Fenrar's teeth. Richard was at a loss. Without weapons, there was nothing they could do to save their friend. He looked around in despair, searching for something he could use against Fenrar. What he saw took his breath away. Flying towards the Oasis was a white-winged horse. It came in low over the water, creating whirlpools of turbulence with each beat of its wide, snowy wings. Its mane flowed back in the wind, and its galloping hooves kicked up little plumes of spray as they caught the surface. Richard knew that their salvation was at hand. Fenrar, too, had seen the apparition. He bared his teeth in a snarl, then let out a ragged howl. Melik fell from his jaws. Ignoring his cuts, the little scribe scrabbled over to Richard and Orkin. For an instant, Fenrar's eyes twitched in their direction, then turned to the approaching horse. As he did so, the wolf's legs and muzzle began to stretch. His body filled out, and hooves formed in place of paws. Fenrar was becoming a winged horse. The white horse came into land with the sun behind him. Fenrar shielded his eyes against the glare and lunged with his hooves, but the white horse struck him with such force that Fenrar lost his balance. Then, with a torrent of heavy blows, the white horse smashed Fenrar to the ground. The trio watched with disbelief as Fenrar's inert body changed into a myriad of different shapes before disappearing completely. The white horse cantered over to Richard. "I am Ravan," the horse said gently. "I'm glad I reached you in time. Golan's forces are almost ready. I have come to help you to complete your quest." "There's still one more pod to find here," Richard said urgently. "But Fenrar took all our belongings, including the pods I had." "Everything is hidden over here," Ravan said, heading towards a sand dune. The companions rushed to retrieve their belongings. After donning his armor, Richard took out the Pathfinder and soon located the last pod. It was nestling amongst a massive razor-edged palm frond at the top of one of the tallest trees at the Oasis. The trunk of the tree was covered in sharp, down-pointing projections. "I'll get scratched to pieces climbing this," Richard said, glancing at the trunk's vicious surface. "Leave it to me," Ravan said. The horse flew above the tree and, gripping the pod gently between his teeth, brought it down to Richard. Orkin and Melik whooped with joy as Richard held the purple pod in his palm. That was it. The last pod. His quest was almost over. "Well done," Ravan said. "Now, all of you, get on my back, and I'll take you to the Ancestral City." Richard, Orkin, and Melik clambered onto Ravan's back. Seconds later, they were in the air circling above Wizard's Well. As they flew high above the ground, Ravan brought the trio up to date with the news of the underground's progress. Golan had rallied all his forces and was waiting only for Richard's return with the pods. There was also bad news. Armor, guardian of the common beasts, had been killed by Khazards before he was able to rejoin Brune and the rest of his troops. The Evil One was summoning his most powerful forces to the Ancestral City. His army would be bigger, stronger, and more terrifying than anything Golan's forces had encountered so far. Richard realized that his task was far from finished. On the horizon, the sky was darkening with the first black clouds of night. Or was it night? Something deep inside told Richard that the darkness had more to do with the Evil One than with any natural occurrence. For a while, the three made sporadic conversation, then fell silent as they sped towards the Ancestral City and to possible death in the final battle. And that is the end of book number 25. So, true story. The same night that I recorded this episode, I was randomly on a website for a drink supplier, and one of their drinks was called Fenrir and had a giant wolf on the label. So it turns out that in Norse mythology, Fenrir is a monstrous wolf, and his parents were the god Loki and the giantess Angrboda. It was just so bizarre learning this by chance, only having just recorded this episode hours beforehand. Anyway, how did you go with the challenge for this issue? Shumi and Shubi appeared here on page 387, and did you spot the Life Force pod? It was on top of this tree on page 398. Don't forget to download the Monsters and Magic cards that came with this issue, and see if you can guess who Fenrar is based on. There were no map pieces or letter tokens to collect with this issue, but we will finally answer the Power of Evil riddle in the next episode. There's only one more to go. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button so you can be notified when the next final episode drops. And until then, stay tuned, stay skull-brained.